G'day.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I'm James Scullin, the Program Director at Asia Society Australia, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. Asia Society is partnering with the Wheeler Centre for this event this evening, which is the launch of the wonderful book by Cheng Lei, A Memoir of Freedom. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which the event is taking place, and acknowledge any First Nations people with us here today. I pay my respects to elders past and present. For those who don't know Asia Society Australia, we're the Australian Centre of Asia Society, a global organisation dedicated to understanding Australia and its role in understanding Asia and its role in the world. Our mission is to advance Australia's prosperity and security in Asia. We do this through corporate partnerships, programs, research and commentary that deepen Australia's understanding of Asia, provide policy ideas for business and government, and create contemporary connections and networks in the region. Now, the empty chair next to me is an initiative of PEN Melbourne, the local chapter of PEN International, an organisation which defends writers' silence for peacefully practising their craft. Journalists, poets, bloggers, rappers, and commentators who risk their freedom and lives to speak truth in repressive regimes and conflict zones. Journalism is not a crime, yet too often those who expose injustice are murdered or imprisoned with impunity. In recent years, PEN has documented the tragic deaths of media workers in Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar, and beyond. They stand with writers in prison and let them know they are not forgotten. The PEN empty chair symbolises those who cannot be with us here because they are imprisoned or silenced. Tonight, it honours Australian citizen Dr. Yang Henjun, novelist, scholar, and democracy advocate detained by Chinese authorities since 2019. After secret detention and reported torture, Dr. Yang was tried behind closed doors and in 2024 sentenced to death with a 2-year suspension, likely to be commuted to life if he remains compliant. This sentence, issued without consular access, violates international agreements and exposes China's disregard for due process. In a letter to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, which Young sent from prison earlier this year, he wrote, "I feel all of your support beside me as I stagger through the hardest and darkest chapter of my life, allowing me to immerse in the warmth of humanity. PEN calls for Young's release and urges solidarity with all writers persecuted for speaking truth to power."
And if you'd like to write to Dr. Yang, you can actually do that via an email, centre.conops, that's CONOPS, @dfat.gov.au. And I think Kylie Moore-Gilbert in the room really understand how precious these letters are from the outside, especially strangers.
Okay, thank you, Lei. Now, before we introduce Lei, just some housekeeping. There will be copies of Lei's book available at the end of tonight's session, and Lei's kind enough to offer to stay behind and sign some books, which will happen after we finish at 7:30. And there'll also be the opportunity for you all to ask questions. We're doing that via the app Slido. So if you use your phone and scan the link on the screen, I'll have questions coming through on the iPad throughout the session, and I'll be feeding them into the session where possible. So please think about your questions and make them brief so I can read them out. So without any further ado, I think everyone knows who Cheng Lei is, but by means of introduction, Cheng Lei is an Australian Chinese journalist who has worked in the media for over 20 years, from her start in finance to covering China during its economic rise, starting in the early 2000s. Even during her imprisonment, she has always been impassioned about using her bilingual advantage and bicultural insights to be the medium between two worlds. She received the Press Freedom Award from the Australian Press Council in 2024 and was the Australian newspaper's Australian of the Year in 2023. She's currently a presenter and columnist for Sky News Australia. Can you all put your hands together for Cheng Lei?
Thank you.
So Lei, I just wanted to start by asking you how you are. I know you just came from Sydney, where you did the Sydney book launch. Obviously, as a proud Victorian, this is the book launch that means the most to you, I would say.
This is the one that matters, right? This is hometown.
So The book is, a very frank and detailed account of your 1,150 days incarcerated in China. It's told with a lot of emotional weight, but also quite a bit of humour, and I think people who know you would not be surprised by that. You've been back in Australia for just under 2 years now. What's the experience like talking about your experience that you've had?
So I'm a fairly extroverted person, and spending my formative years in Australia made me even more open and outgoing. And to have this career in communication was perfect. So I'm all about finding out about the world, expressing, communicating, and then it all got shut down. I felt I was being buried alive. I joked in my head that I was running Coffin FM when I was sitting there for 14 hours a day doing nothing. And that is extreme suffocation when every move you make might be cause for punishment or at least chiding. And even having a bit of fun, having a laugh, carries with it the fear that the dreaded buzzer will sound and you'll have to go back to your sitting position or to separate from your little huddle with cellmates. So after that, this is writing and talking is like an extreme form of exhalation. This is how you reverse the damage. All the secrets that they like to keep, the Chinese authorities, all the things you cannot talk about, including my name, where I came from, why I was in such a dreadful place. And now I can do that because there were people commenting online that Cheng Lei must have something to hide if she's not telling her story. And during my incarceration, nobody knew what was going on. Nobody could really talk in detail about my case. And even the last days of towards my freedom, the Chinese condition was that one word about where I was, about what was happening, and the whole deal would be off. I would stay locked up. So all this is defiance. It's fuck you.
So just to go back to your origin story, so to speak, you were born in China, your family moved to Australia when you were 10, and the book is very much a love letter to Australia. There's so many references about Australiana.
Tracky Dax.
Australian flora, Cold Chisel, John Farnham, Violet Crumble, your love of Australian beaches. But when you decided to change your career from finance to journalism, you pursued that career in Asia, predominantly in China. What was it that drew you back to China for that career?
I'd always really enjoyed being able to be the medium between two worlds. When my parents were working or studying in Australia, I was their little interpreter, translator. And then at uni, while my course was commerce, I also did electives in translation. And I feel that I am actually linguistically and culturally schizophrenic. I can be, just at the touch of a button, switch my brain from Chinese to English and crack jokes in both languages. I love that. So when China was really changing from backward and poor to a country that seemed to be on the cusp of the 2000s, to be embracing liberalization and globalization, I really felt it was an opportunity for me to join it and report on it.
So when you were working in China, you were working for CGTN, which is the English language state-owned news organization. As a journalist, how did you feel about that relationship working with a state-owned entity in media? And what was your sense of knowing where the line was in terms of censorship and these things that we know about Chinese media?
I had 3 phases in my work. One was the year and a half that I spent with CGTN's predecessor. It was called CCTV9 back then. And that was when, as I said, China was really eager to embrace all things of the outside, including liberalizing its media sector. And there were even hopes that foreign media organizations can set up quite freely in China. Those hopes gradually dissipated. But I also spent 9 years at an American organization called CNBC, where, for example, I would be reporting on the same day, reporting in English on the Chinese markets and the economy to a global audience for CNBC. But they had a joint venture partner in China, and I would be reporting about global markets in Chinese to the Chinese audience. And there I discovered where some of the lines were. For example, when I said, well, today the South Korean and the Hong Kong markets are closed for Buddha's birthday, I was told that you don't mention anything about religion, which as a business reporter, really, I was taken aback. How is that even, what's that got to do with anything? Why do you care about that? And then, for example, interviewing a brokerage chief in Beijing before the Olympics, and because I said, does the Communist Party direct you to buy these stocks and manipulate the market? And this brokerage chief got so angry that he ordered our camera be seized, the tape, back then it was still tape, the tape taken, and wouldn't let us go. And because CNBC operating in China still has to conform to the censors, they are often brought in to the authorities, and they even have a ranking of which foreign media organization had the most infractions this month. And it's sort of like, oh, well, you were a bad boy this month, and you get points taken off, and so on. So that affects, obviously, to what extent you can show your programming in China, and also, more importantly, how you can attract those cashed up Chinese state-owned organizations like the Bank of China that advertise their very lucrative sources of income.
In the book, you mentioned that there is censorship training available, but because you're an Australian national, you weren't provided that training.
It was confidentiality training.
Right.
So after Xi came into power, the state security paranoia just grew and grew. And I started noticing there were lots of mentions of confidentiality, and I didn't think it applied to me because as a foreign citizen, I didn't have to pass that training. And I just assumed that I wouldn't be getting any confidential documents.
I'd like you to take us through the events of August 13.
My favourite day, right?
2020. I mean, obviously it started off like a normal day. What can you tell us about how that day transpired?
So, of course, the detail is in the book. But to this day, I wonder why they set a trap to bring me into work to grab me. Because later, it became obvious to me that they had scoped out where I lived. They had probably put bugs inside my apartment and probably had been watching me for months. But why did they think that I was so good as a spy that I would flee if they, didn't make me feel it was a normal work day? So I go into work thinking, wow, head of the channel is really interested in my new show, and rehearsing in my head what I'm going to say to win him over. And then the next 5 minutes changed my life completely. And from then on, I am never alone. Even on that first day, going to the toilet, I was shadowed by 2 police officers.
And so how long after that day did it take you to understand what you were actually accused of?
They accused me of paying for intel and supplying it to a foreign organization. And then they changed that charge 6 months later to just supplying intel to a foreign organization. And in those 6 months, there were some 30 interrogations where everything is questioned. Even my grandparents, who passed away a long time ago. But that's how China works.
So back in 2020, the Australia-China relationship was at a bit of a low point. April 17, the foreign minister at the time called for an independent COVID inquiry at the origins of COVID. And then April 23, you learn later that surveillance had begun on you. Do you feel the Australia-China relationship played the major role in your arrest?
I think so, because the suspicion for starting surveillance on me, as it was told in court, is that I was in frequent contact with foreign journalists, which is absurd considering I'd been doing that for 20 years and considering a foreign journalist should be in frequent contact with other foreign journalists. And why then? Why did they do that? But two other factors, I think, maybe affected their decision to arrest me. One, my critical posts of China's handling of the pandemic, and then two, my frequenting embassies, because I was working on this show about cooking and dining with ambassadors.
And I actually remember you hosting briefings from the Australian Embassy. The Australian Embassy would host these business briefings with the Chamber, Austrade, DFAT, and...
Did you sit in on that one?
I sat on all of them, yeah.
The one where somebody actually asked if Australians should get out because of the threat of arbitrary detention?
Because the two Michaels, the two Canadians, had been detained at that point.
Yes, 2 years before already.
Yeah. In the book, you mentioned the fact that you, Chinese Australian, made you an easier target for Chinese authorities. Why do you say that?
I think it's deeply ingrained in the Chinese psyche that there is China and then the rest of the world. There is an insider and then the outsiders. It's really apparent in the language that's used. So there is 国, which means country, and then there's 外国, an external country, and 外国人, and a country of. So even though Chinese people go abroad, they take on different passports, different accents, different values, but the Chinese psyche, especially where the State Security Ministry is concerned, they find these people to be particularly abhorrent. An officer once said to me, they seem to have different degrees of hatred. So I guess the most hated is somebody who used to be in their system and then went outside. I think there's jealousy and there's just a very harsh kind of vehemence to getting them. And that's why Dr. Yang, who used to work in the Ministry of State Security, is perhaps so harshly sentenced. And then the second on the list would probably be people like me, who look Chinese, speak Chinese, but have taken on foreign citizenship.
So when you were...
Whereas non-Chinese are seen as, well, they're foreigners anyway, so...
Is there something more subtle about it being Chinese Australian, that there's an inference that will create less media attention?
I think so, because the two Michaels were Caucasians, and China did suffer quite a backlash in terms of Western sentiment towards China by Canadians, and they just think, Chinese Australians' family is less likely to be so vocal, because even my parents, they'd been here for some 40 years and they were still saying, don't go to the media because China will just punish you worse.
And when you were on the inside, what about your interrogators? Do you feel like did they treat you like an Australian? Or obviously you're speaking Chinese with them. How do you judge the way they assigned you a nationality?
I think they were very mixed. There was that feeling of, you traitor, which is perhaps the worst thing you can call a Chinese person, a 汉奸, China's traitor. But then they could also hear from me that I'm pretty naive and I like to think a pretty nice person. So, and of course, differed between officers, and sometimes they would take roles like good cop, bad cop, but they did like to lecture me in things like, you don't know these things about China, you've been outside too long, or try to tell me these lies like we have separation of powers, we have judicial transparency. I mean, come on.
So you're taken from your apartment to RSDL, so you spend time in two distinct formats of Chinese prison. Can you tell everyone what is RSDL and what kind of makes it unique in the Chinese prison system?
If there is one goal that I really want to achieve out of all this speaking and writing, is to have so much attention on this form of human rights abuse that China abolishes it, even if eventually. It is psychological torture. It is tailored to your level of cooperation and your status or your particular role. It is basically aimed at making you feel helpless, hopeless, driving you to the edge of insanity and suicide, but you have no means with which to hurt yourself. People in the my friends in the audience would know that I'm a life lover, but there were moments I wanted to end it.
So in the RSDL, which is the residential surveillance at a designated location, you are observed 24/7, and you have two people in the room, and what is it, 40 centimetres away from you at all times?
About where that mic is.
Right. I mean, what is that job of the people who are doing that?
They're technical school students from another province, so they're not even from Beijing, and not very highly educated. So I don't know how they got duped into doing this, but I think it's as inhumane or more inhumane for them as it is for me to have to watch somebody in pain and to have to wear a mask, not be able to speak, drink water, go to the toilet even. I had to watch somebody crap her pants because they couldn't get a sub. That is just, who does that to people? That's sadistic.
And so you needed to ask them permission to do anything in that cell?
Yes, that's right. And sometimes they would radio Central Command. But what I discovered was that after some months, because I treated them politely and I was empathetic to them when they were sick, or like when that guard couldn't go to the toilet, that they became sympathetic towards me. Like if I was crying silently, a guard would go to the toilet and get me some toilet tissue. And if they saw that I was, I was in a lot of pain, they would, without me asking, radio Central Command and ask if I could have a 10-minute lie down.
At first, it seems to take a long time for you to have access to reading materials in RSDL. But throughout your whole 3 years being incarcerated, you read 300 books in prison. What was the experience of reading like in the cells? And what did that give you in terms of escapism? And how does it compare to reading when you're outside of a cell?
Everything that I say about books, I mean, now to you, who have all the world's books at your fingertips, probably sounds extreme and even wanky, but the books were the light. Books held me. Books were my friend, and books were my pain relievers. I remember reading The Book of Tea by a Japanese writer and translated into Chinese beautifully by a Taiwanese writer. And even just reading the first page, the foreword, I had a physical reaction. It was like pain being lifted away. And I just, after I got out, going to a library was a very emotional experience.
So you mentioned The Book of Tea. What were some other memorable books that mattered to you while you were in prison?
Prison memoirs. So when you're suffering, you need a counterpoint to humble yourself and distract you from your own misery. Books that change your way of thinking, like Guns, Germs and Steel, like Homo Sapiens by Yuval Harari. And I remember one line in that book, which is about happiness. And when he says, happiness is just a biochemical process. And some people are just naturally wired to have a higher level of happiness. And I thought, hey, that's me. So science, even when I couldn't understand it, it was a different prism to see the world and to understand what I was going through.
Do you know what books didn't get through? So obviously the Chinese authorities review everything coming through to you. I think there's a part in the book where you talk about at the end, when you're leaving, there's the books that didn't filter through. Which ones were prohibited?
Those 40 books were just out of spite. But some of the books that it told me didn't get through. One was a book on China-Australia relations.
Okay.
It didn't get through. Surprise, surprise. A book by Nick Hornby called The Suicide Club, seen as too dangerous. And Coles and Woolies catalogues.
Oh, wow.
What was that about?
Yeah, there's some lethal advertising in the Chinese prison.
Well, I might be showing it to my cellmates and they might, be all inspired to move to Australia or something.
So you spend 6 months in the RSDL system where you're predominantly alone, aside from your minders. You then move to the second prison where you spend the predominance of your time, which is called detention in China. And this is where we're introduced to your fellow inmates who you spend a lot of time with. So there's PB. Can you tell everyone what PB means?
Psycho bitch.
There's OG, who's the
Ottawa grandma.
Kanto, who's from
Hong
Guangdong
Kong.
province, and Skinny, that pretty much speaks for itself. Now, in the book you say, in the cell, fun and fear intermingled. Can you elaborate on that?
Another interviewer called me the Captain Fun of detention. So I was always trying to make up jokes, games, share with them funny thoughts I had, teach them English and Daggy 80 songs. And because the whole purpose of detention is to make you self-reflect, make you hate yourself, and to take away your humanity. That is, that you are affectionate, that you like to help people, that you like to share things. You're not even allowed to give things to people. And I remember giving a hug to a cellmate once and getting the dreaded buzz-up. So you could sort of quickly jump away when you're having this, very tender human moment. I remember just trying to show Kanto, who was my best mate in there, a photo of my kids just by slanting, because we're all sitting on the edge of the bed, slanting the letter with the photo a little bit, and what are you doing? You're not allowed to show your letters. What could it... Was it a state secret? So you are never fully at ease. And at night, in winter, you like to put your arms inside the covers, but you're not allowed to do that. So if you do that by accident, and then that will wake up everyone in the cell. So the person who does it feels terribly guilty.
But I think that makes it all the more remarkable what you did get away with in the cell. So your cellmates referred to you
thanks to COVID, I think.
Well, your cellmates, referred to you as teacher. As you mentioned, you teach them songs. You make raps together. You teach them about English, teach them about Australia. But you're also very crafty. So when it was someone's birthday, you had a way of making a cake. I think it was Kanto's birthday.
Yes.
So can you walk us through the process? How did you create a sponge cake in prison under surveillance?
I was actually inspired by an Australian writer's book cover, which featured a 3-tier cake, and the only substitute ingredient was the steamed bread that we get for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So to make it, there were no tools. This is a place where the toothpaste cap is taken away, where any packaging, like the plastic insert inside a packet of biscuits is taken out, and you have to use your bowl to contain the biscuits. They are so paranoid about safety. And so the only tool I had was, as a knife, was this plastic packaging from tofu squares, and that I would tear with my teeth to make into a tiny little soft floppy knife. And I used the water cup lid as a kind of a cookie cutter to make the round shapes. And anything that we had, because it was right after Chinese New Year, we were allowed to buy a few things, and any of those ingredients were pulled together and then made with milk powder into a sort of slurry that we spread onto each layer of the sort of flattened steamed bread. And then to let the flavours marinate, as it were, we had to put it near the door where there was a draft, so it was like a fridge. And later, using sort of the hot months, I was teaching them how to make soft cheese or yogurt. It was sometimes hit and miss, but it gave us something to do, something that changed, because the monotony was the worst part.
But are you doing this under the covers? Like, how are you doing this in surveillance?
So you remember the officers' rosters? So you know roughly which ones are a little bit nicer, which ones are assholes, and you avoid those shifts. And you also have to remember when the monthly raid would be, because if I'm there with the cake or the moonshine, and then the door opens, and then these people in hazmat suits come in, ready to do the strip search, it's all over. It's not just confiscating, but there will be... You'll have to write self-bashing essays, there'll be other punishments, privileges taken away, etc.
So for Canto's birthday, just going back to the cake, you managed to pair that with your own apple cider moonshine. Walk us through how you made that.
Well, because of COVID, we were given these one apple each for 2 weeks. And I was reading a book called The History of Wine. And it said the origin of wine was just primitive man seeing rotting fruit, and then somehow that gave off a lovely fragrance, and then trying it and probably, going to a coma, but a very pleasant one. So I thought, we can try that. And
you've got time.
Yeah, and it's in there that you're so hungry for knowledge. You just wish you had watched more episodes of, DIY shows, Burke's Backyard or anything. But all I had was, we could buy sugar, and I had so for all 3 years, I ate with a disposable spoon, and of course you're never given new spoons, you just eat with the one disposable spoon, which goes soft after heating hot food for a while, and using that to scrape off to sort of make an apple mash into my water cup, and adding sugar, sealing it with wet toilet paper, and hoping for the best. But when the bubbles started to come, we were so excited. And my cellmate Canto, she's very impatient, so she'll be checking, and because all our belongings are kept under the bed in these compartments, so she'll be checking so often. I say, no, you're going to get us sprung. Stop it. But as I said, it's just that sense of, you can anticipate something. And eventually it went mouldy, but I scraped off the mould and drank it, and then made a second batch, and you can find out how we avoided the mould in the book.
Now, a really interesting passage in the book is where you develop this elaborate code to communicate to the people in adjacent cells in detention, particularly this individual. Everyone's only known by numbers, really, so particularly this individual 20012.
I found out his name, yeah.
Oh, you did find out his name?
Yeah.
Oh, through the code?
Yes.
Yeah. So how did you construct this code, and tell us how it worked?
Well, it's quite... the whole process is quite long, so you can read about it in the book, but I guess what that illustrates is how desperate you are to communicate. And that is a very human thing. You live there 2 meters apart, but with these thick walls between you, and you know that they are going through the same pains as you are, but you'll never see them. And in some ways, because your schedules for going into this concrete enclosure are so separate that you don't really know that they exist. So when you can actually, through the wall knocking, communicate, get a message through, share things, it's like enlivening that part of you that is, we are naturally social animals. So it's also a slap in the face for them who try to keep people so separate because they don't want you to share your secrets. And this is us reclaiming some of that power.
Someone from the audience asks, have you spoken to Cantos, Skinny or Hayes since your release?
No, I reached out to Hayes. She didn't respond.
Oh, sorry, can you tell us who Hayes is?
Hayes was my former good friend in Beijing. She worked at Bloomberg, and she's the one that I texted the dreaded 8 words to 7 minutes early. That was the charge anyway in court. And she was also arrested for a while, and she gave a testimony that ended up in my conviction. So I had anger towards her, but because she was, and also I had heard her voice in detention. She was unlucky enough to have been locked up with a psycho bitch for a while, so I felt sorry for her. And she even sent me a message via the embassy that she had heard me singing Christmas carols on Christmas Day.
Before your
But none of the others. I tried to contact their families, but I think they've already been spoken to. So they were very scared about any contact from me. But I am going to try to find all of these inmates for the rest of my life.
What about your physical health in prison? How did you stay fit? How did you, manage your physical sanity while you were incarcerated?
At first, because of RSDL, couldn't move, and I even got a back injury from just sitting. And then a few months later, I discovered that my blood pressure was creeping up. So I started to do a lot more exercises, a lot of ab crunches, a lot of squats, just punching in the air, on the ground, no bras, no shoes except for these men's slippers or very thin cloth shoes, but doing push-ups on the edge of the bed or on the concrete floor, and yoga. It really helped me because it produces the endorphins and clears the mind, and at the same time I will be trying to remember vocab from language learning. So you're combining two things that take discipline at the same time.
But you also didn't see your reflection for a number of years, is that true?
Yeah. There was a little strip of 3 centimetre wide acrylic glass near the door that we called the mirror, but it's actually just reflects a shadow. So when I did finally see myself, as you'll read in the book, not a good experience.
There's this very triumphant part in the book where you put on a bra when you're released from prison. Why were bras prohibited there?
I have no idea. I must go and look up some prison dramas where bras were used as lethal weapons, but they just prohibit so many things. When in doubt, just ban it. Because it's easier for them and they don't care what discomfort it brings you.
So all this time in RSDL, in detention, you hadn't been sentenced. And so leading up to your sentencing, you're preparing yourself for a 5-year sentence. And you get served, I think it's 2 years and 10 months, which is the total
11.
time that you'd been detained. As you'd been preparing yourself for that 5-year sentence, do you feel you were prepared for another 3 more years in detention?
Well, I wanted to be sent to jail as soon as possible,
Right.
and that's what I said at the trial, because then I could get family visits. And to me, that was more important than anything. That was why I confessed, or so-called confessed, and said I was guilty, because that's the only way to get to my kids. And I was trying to work out how old they would be, and I begged the prosecutor to leave me a little bit more of my children's childhood, because I was afraid that by the time I was released, they wouldn't even want to spend time with Mum anymore. So I'm very glad that when I did see my kids, at least my son, he still very much likes cuddles.
So how did you feel when the judge said that it was the 2 years and 11 months? I mean, did that come as a complete surprise to you, or had they kind of been indicating that it was leaning towards you were imminently going to be released?
I think he didn't want me to faint in court.
Okay.
So about an hour and a half before, he came to my little cage, they call it the cage, sort of 1 metre wide and long. And it was the biggest surprise of my life, the fact that he said that he was all smiling and saying, I think you'll be satisfied with the sentence.
Okay.
But then not knowing exactly what that meant, I was just totally bewildered for that hour and a half.
Yeah, well, it sounds like they were rooting for you in a way.
Yeah, I mean, he had never smiled at me before. And it's sick that their humanity gets taken away as well. Because if he's a normal human being, to see me month after month crying at all the embassy visits, he sat in on that precious half-hour phone conversation that I had with my kids as well. And to have to remain impassive and almost to look as if he hated me, to not show sympathy, that's hard. And then from that point onwards, every time he saw me, he was smiling. And it's a sick system.
So knowing what you know now, what do you feel the turning point was that triggered your release?
I feel things started to change after the change of government in 2022. I heard that the Australian government leaders were raising my case at every opportunity. Penny Wong used to tweet about me on my birthday and anniversaries of incarceration. And maybe the fact that my public love letter to Australia gained such a strong response, and even former PM John Howard wrote to a very senior leader, and it was a very pitch-perfect letter that didn't say, oh, you're terrible, but said, have some sympathy for her. I think they all helped. I'm not religious, and I'm not what one would call spiritual, but in times of desperation, I like to think that everything helped. Every kind thought that ordinary Australians had. All the prayers. I was shown to the chapel in Presentation Sisters Convent in Perth, where Sister Mary and her other sisters had prayed for us. My daughter's school prayed for us.
Since your release, you've formed AWADA, the Australian Wrongful Arbitrary Detention Alliance, along with Kylie Moore-Gilbert and Sean Turnell. How did those similar experiences support you during detention and then once you came home?
I read Kylie's book, which is amazing. It's called Uncaged Sky, and I got letters from her and also from Peter Grester. And it's something else to be written to by someone who's gone through the same experience. You gain so much strength and hope from their words. So when I got out and found out that Kylie and Sean were even more amazing than their books, the bond was instant. And yes, we do have sometimes, joke fests, like yesterday in our chat group called Ex-Cons. We were making fun of this new trend where tech titans go to darkness retreats. And we said, let's run our own retreats. We could do a 3-step program using the torture methods from China, Myanmar, and Iran, and they have to pay heaps of money for it.
So we talked about Dr. Young before. What do you feel is the appropriate response when Australians are detained? Whether it's from media, government, or the general public. Do you feel like there's things that we've learnt from these experiences of yours, Kylie's, and Sean's?
I think a good deterrent is lots of publicity, and it's because of the fundamental differences in value systems. In China, the state overrides all else. The individual is like an ant or a piece of grass. So contrast that to our high regard for individuals, where the foreign minister of China actually questions why we make such a fuss over an individual, says a lot. So when we do have a lot of public sympathy, it really shows them how little, how petty, how just inhumane that is to play chess with human lives. I think we can also try to help the detainees' families, because often they are confused and they may be tempted to take the advice of bureaucracy, which is often to stay silent and hope for the best, hope for quiet diplomacy. But as we know, governments need sometimes a little push, and we can be very strategic about our media. We don't always say more is best or the louder the better. It's about how you craft the message, which my former partner Nick was very good at doing.
So when you are released, there's a beautiful line in the book, you don't realise how dead you are until you come back to life. You spent 1,150 days in prison, and you've lost a lot of time.
I lost a lot of weight too.
Right.
The Wonder Diet.
How have you navigated things like, your children obviously so important, the huge thread throughout the book. How have you navigated parenting and family upon your release, particularly given this gap of 3 years?
It's very frustrating, and I struggle with trying to be the disciplined mum and wanting to compensate for all the time that they lost. But I think it says a lot about our society that despite this trauma, they're quite well adjusted. And yes, there is scarring, but I also hear about the support that they got from kids at school, from my extended family, and teachers who bought them presents when nobody else did. And contrast that to Kanto, who was so worried about her daughter's prospects for employment, because in China, even for employment, you have to write down what your parents did. And she's worried that this mark of MSS imprisonment is going to hurt that, and even marriage prospects.
A question from the audience. How have you come to terms with the prospect of not being able to potentially ever return to China?
There are lots of things we can't do in life, and if there is a regime change, if one day I am made to feel welcome and safe enough to go, that's great. But otherwise, I still observe what's happening in China. I still have Chinese friends who, some daring ones, do talk to me. And I want to still play that role, to be the medium between worlds.
Tell us about the experience of writing the book. So there's this, really funny passage in the book where they basically say, don't write a book about this experience. And you're like, oh, well, I'm going to, you can't really stop me. Do you, was the experience the same as you thought it was going to be writing the book? What was it like there's so much detail in the book. What was it like going through all that detail? And, do you feel like you got some sense of closure by writing the book?
Oh, absolutely. I started writing it even in the halfway house 3 days before my freedom flight back to Australia. I had always liked writing, and especially the feel of pen and paper. And in there, because they're afraid of words, you know that the Chinese word for prison consists of a dog and a beast, and in the middle, speech. So they only gave you a pen every fortnight for 5 minutes to write down your shopping list. The foreign citizens got a pen and paper to write letters to family once a month, and they confiscated my books when they discovered that I had made notes on the margins, because that was how a Japanese ex-detainee of a few years ago, Hideji Suzuki, who I just got in touch with today. Can you imagine our conversations? And he smuggled out all these detailed notes that a Supreme Justice who was in his cell had told him, all the political gossip. So after that, they tightened rules on books and margins, notes. So I was desperate to write. And I had some lucky days where, for example, in Perth, where my dad lives, I just got up at 4 or 5 a.m., did a few hours of writing, did yoga in the sun, and there were also very frustrating moments where I wanted to cook a new recipe and I wanted to take my son out biking, and I couldn't write down those passages that I wanted to. And I had moments of howling. I remember one particular day at Springvale Library where I was writing, and just people must have thought I was crazy, just losing it. But I was always thinking about it because it's solidarity with my inmates, and it is, like I said, defiance. And it's also like I still see myself in RSDL, that poor person, and it's like giving her a hug. It's like saying, the story is mine. I used to have to write so many lies and so many things demeaning myself, and now I can just write the honest truth.
Question from the audience: How have your parents reacted to the book? Also, given the book is extremely frank. I'm going to quote the questioner here: retelling of your sexy times in prison. What's been the reaction?
You're giving it away.
What's been the reaction from? Have your parents read the book?
My mum, to people who know her, she's on the spectrum. So for days she didn't even. So I had the book there at home. She didn't look at it, didn't touch it, and finally I couldn't stand it anymore because I had just gone to my sort of godmother's house for afternoon tea, and she was the one who went through my manuscript. And we had been talking about the book, and she was so pleased for me, and it was lovely. And I come home and I said to Mum, I'm so glad Jane, looks at my book and touches the book. You don't. So now she says, oh. And then a day later, she says, I will try to read it. She still hasn't. And my dad has said, send me, or I'm going to see him next month. So he says his friends want copies.
Oh, well, do you have an edited version for them, maybe?
He says he's English now that he's 81 is not that good anymore, so I'm glad he's not going to try to read it.
Another question from the audience. How did you find DFAT and embassy staff throughout the ordeal? They, kind of play this secondary character role. How do you appraise, what DFAT and the Australian government could do given the difficulties of your circumstances?
The officer who came to visit me the most times, Tony Pobje, and a few others who were constants. I think that really helps. Somebody who's a familiar face. They are all professional, of course, but in the end, I began to see Tony as family. And Chris, who would read out the news extracts to me. And I even wrote a little poem to DFAT, or to those consular officers. I said they were the fuzzy wuzzies of DFAT. And they were my periscope, from the underground to the outside world.
There's a few questions around liberalisation and human rights in China. I guess, we could sum it up in, can China change? Do you feel like there's any change on the horizon for China, given, it's a very different China now than it was 15 years ago?
I think predicting change is a little bit like predicting avalanches or earthquakes. You don't know which grain of sand or snow or, earth activity is going to precipitate in the ultimate event. But after what I've been through, I like to think that every little bit helps. And we just keep doing things to push in the right direction. And we keep speaking up for justice. And we always keep the value and the cost of freedom in mind.
So that brings me to my final question. So you mentioned Peter Grest, wrote to you in prison. He's got this really lovely quote: "Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Now, I think, the audience can't expect to be incarcerated in a Chinese prison, but everyone goes through their own adversity, and the book is very much about resilience. What's your advice to people going through adversity, given that not only you went through this experience over 3 years, but there's also some cases earlier in your life that you talk about in the book. And the book is very much a testament to adversity. But what can you say to people in terms of, going through a difficult time that you've learned, given all your struggles?
Obviously, the one thing is to help others. When you're responsible for others, they say, like survival specialists say, that doctors and nurses often survive horrific ordeals because they feel responsible, and then they discount their own woes. Concentrating on one's own misery often compounds that. And the one funny habit I've picked up since release is when I meet people and interact with them, I start to think about their cellmate potential. So,
cellmate radar.
Yeah, because it is exactly like you said in that quote. It's all about your attitude. You can be the richest man, the prettiest person in the room, but still feel horrible, or you can be quite ordinary, but just able to extract pleasure from the smallest things, and including times of adversity. So I'd like to think that we can all be, good cellmate material, in that we are fun and we channel strength and hope and help others.
We can all find that ideal cellmate within.
Yes.
Okay, well, we're at time. Can you all please put your hands together for the brilliant Cheng Lei?